Hi, everyone, and welcome to Chapter 8 of Psych 4100. This chapter is going to cover everyday memory, sort of how we use and sort of interact with memory on a day to day basis, as well as a substantial discussion in the second half, part two of this lecture, on memory errors, false memory, things of that nature. So let's dive right in with some questions to consider. Things like what kinds of events from our lives are we most likely to remember? Is there something special about memory for extraordinary events? What properties of the memory system make it both highly functional and useful to us? But ironically, those same properties can make it prone to error. Why is eyewitness testimony often cited as the case of wrongful convictions? We occasionally hear about people being let out of prison after being convicted where someone was an eyewitness. Then that eyewitness maybe recants their testimony, turns out it wasn't true. DNA evidence exonerates the prisoner, right? Why does this happen? How does this happen? And actually the study of memory, right, can inform us a lot about this particular topic. And lastly, sort of a larger question that's often difficult to understand: why would someone confess to a crime they didn't commit? In essence, admit to doing something or having a memory of doing something that they never actually did. How is that possible? Okay, so what we're really talking about a lot here are things called autobiographical memories. If we remember back from our discussion of the structure of long term memory, these are memories for specific experiences from your life. They can include both episodic, sort of experiential, mental time travel components. So being able to feel or hear or see or re experience those events, as well as semantic components, just sort of um, the data, right? The fact that you did certain things. So, for example, my undergraduate, the where I got my undergrad degree is a school in Greenville, South Carolina called Furman University. I know semantically, like, I went to Furman University and I graduated with a BS in psychology in the year 2009. Right, that's a fact, an autobiographical fact from my life. But then I can also have episodic memories of being there, of doing certain things while I was in college. Critically, these autobiographical memories are multidimensional. They involve space, time, emotion, sensory components, right? The things you hear, taste, smell, see. These are very, very rich and dynamic types of memories. Um, and the sensory component to these memories seems to be incredibly important, and perhaps one of the things that really sets them apart as being special from other memories. Because we know from some work by Greenberg and Rubin that patients who have difficulty recognizing objects, this is actually a neurological disorder, where people will look at an object and they have trouble knowing what that object is. They can interact with the object, they can use the object, but what they actually have difficulty with is sort of finding the name for that object. It's not tip of the tongue. This is a very specific sort of neurological visual memory sort of combo disorder where people experience this lack of object recognition. So someone with this issue might see a coffee cup on a table. They are perfectly capable of reaching out, picking up, and drinking from the coffee cup, but they would have a difficult time recognizing the object as such just from their visual experience. And we know that these people who have this object recognition problem also have problems with autobiographical memory. They experience greater losses of autobiographical memories than in neurotypical patients. And so, what this suggests in particular is that visual experience might play a really important role in forming as well as retrieving autobiographical memories. So the senses are important in general. Vision might be particularly important for autobiographical memories. Also, taste and smell, which are very closely related to one another in your senses. Taste and smell often are connected to memories as well. One of my favorite memories of my grandmother when we would go visit her is in the mornings. She would make homemade cinnamon sugar donut holes, and it's this very specific smell, right? The frying of the dough and the fryer that she had, the type of oil she used, maybe the smell of the cinnamon and the sugar. It's extremely particular, and if I smell something similar to that again, I'm sort of transported back as a 7-year-old in her kitchen helping her fry donut holes on a Saturday morning. Oops, sorry about that. Um, Interestingly, we can take advantage of this sort of new phenomena of everyone having a camera in their pocket, right? Is a camera phone to actually study autobiographical memory. These researchers brought people into a lab who had taken their own pictures of particular places around. I believe this was around the Duke University college campus. And then they showed people both their own photos of those particular locations, as well as photos taken by the researchers. So it's photos of the same locations, right? Notice this picture of a chapel is the same chapel as the picture on the right. It's just that the pictures on the left were taken by the participants, and the pictures on the right were standardized and taken by the researchers. So what they did is they would put people in an fMRI machine and show them sort of alternating patterns of their photos versus photos taken by the researchers. And the pattern of results is really, really interesting because both types of photos activate similar brain structures. The medial temporal lobe, which we know is involved in episodic memories. So people are sort of reimagining themselves at that place, right? They're remembering, oh, yeah, I remember going to this chapel. It's really beautiful. It's a great example of Gothic architecture. And I was so amazed by, whatever, the spires or this door that you start to re-experience it and have your own episodic memory. These images also activated the parietal cortex, which we use in general for processing scenes. What's interesting is that there was some unique activation to the participants' own images, their own photos that they took. When viewing their own photos, there was activation of the prefrontal cortex, which includes information about the self, which would be the thing that gets combined with this medial temporal activation to produce a true episodic memory about the self, as well as activation of the hippocampus, which is involved in recalling these true self-oriented episodic memories. So there's a few things we can take away from this. One is that autobiographical memories involve a lot of activation across the brain, right? There's distributed coordinated activity in the way that we process the scene in front of us, the way that we process maybe the episode, the self's involvement in that, the recollection of these things. It's a rich, dynamic type of memory. But pictures that you yourself took actually cause unique and differential activation, suggesting that an autobiographical memory really is something special. It's not just memory of this chapel, it is the memory of the particular time that you visited the chapel, which is different from remembering the chapel in general. And we can see here this image just shows that In some areas of the brain, as we said before, the lab photos and someone's own photos in yellow and blue have similar activation. And then in some areas of the brain, someone's own photos have greater activation. So another question we can ask about autobiographical memories are, what are the types of things that you tend to remember? This might not come as a surprise, of course, but you tend to remember highly emotional, important events. And these are often, we can think of as transition points in life. So things like graduation, or maybe the graduation of a loved one, your marriage or the marriage of a loved one, the birth of a child, or a niece or a nephew, something of that nature. These large sort of benchmarks in life, if you will, tend to be highly emotional and tend to indicate transition points in life. And we put a lot of importance on these events, and thus they tend to be remembered very well. Interestingly, there's also some variation across the lifespan in the timing of sort of uh, your greatest number of memories, or the memories that you remember best. So if you ask people over 40, hey, I want you to think back about your life and recall the whatever you can remember, whatever significant events you can remember in your life. Recall tends to be high for very recent events. Obviously, the things that happened to me within the last few weeks or months are easy to recall. But then there's this bump, there's this boost in recall for events in adolescence and early adulthood, which we can sort of loosely define as things that happen to you between the ages of 10 and 30. We get a bump, we get a recollection bump for events that occurred within those ages between 10 and 30. Now, at first blush, there doesn't seem to be, you know, any obvious reason why this should be the case. And in fact, there's probably not one obvious reason or one thing that's happening to give us this reminiscence bump between the ages of 10 and 30, or for events that occurred between the ages of 10 and 30. And so we can consider a few things here. Oh, sorry about that. Here's just a graphic representation of the reminiscence bump. So this is someone who's 55 years old. So they're right here in age, right? Our x-axis is age, our y-axis is the percentage of memories. So if you're 55, then you can remember really well the things that happened to you within the last, 2 to 3 to 4 years. But then things that happened from 30 to maybe 45 or 50 are not remembered as well, or are not produced as well by the participant. And we get this bump in this critical period of remembering things that happened to you between the ages of 10 and 30. And then, of course, before 30, we get fewer memories. There are three main ideas as to why this might be happening. The first is sort of the self-image theory or self-image explanation, which pretty simply says, well, between the ages of 10 and 30 is kind of when people figure out who they are. It's when a lot of these significant life events tend to happen, right? Typically happen in people's lives. Between the ages of 10 and 30, what's generally happening is that people are graduating high school, they're starting a job, they're going to college, they're making the friends that they will have for the rest of their life, right? Your friends that you had when you were 4 are probably not the friends that are important for the rest of your life. It's the friends you make when you're in late high school, when you're in college, when you're, in your 20s. These are the people that become sort of your important framework in life. This is also the time period when people on average tend to start having serious relationships, having children, maybe substantial advances in their career, getting married. So these self-image relevant events tend to occur within this 10-year to 30-year-old time frame. And so we just remember them better because between 30 and 50, we tend to have fewer of those events in age. There's a cognitive explanation, and this explanation is more based in sort of the way that encoding of memory works. And it basically argues that encoding is more successful, so the creation of memories is more successful when you have a period of rapid change followed by stability. So rapid change followed by stability. So graduation and sort of the transition either to college or into the workforce is a period of rapid change followed by a few years of stability. Graduating college or starting a new job or getting married is a rapid change, typically followed by a time of stability. And encoding tends to be really good for those types of events. Rapid changes followed by stability. And lastly, there's a more sort of socio-cultural level of explanation, which argues that this time frame of 10 to 30 is when our culture expects us to engage in these sorts of events. And so we all have this sort of culturally shared expectation that this is the important time, right? This is when all the important stuff happens. So I need to focus on that time frame if you ask me about my life, right? So if you're 55 or 60 years old and someone asks you, what are the big important things that happened in your life? The things that happen to you later, so between 40, 50, 60, might be just as important. Like nothing says that, what happens to you at 45 is less important than what happens to you at 25. It could be even more important, right? People switch careers in their 40s. People completely change major things about their lives in their 40s and 50s. But culturally, when someone asks you these types of questions like, oh, tell me about your life, right? Tell me about the important events that happened to you. We sort of culturally expect people to talk about young adulthood rather than middle adulthood or older adulthood. And so we sort of share this expectation. And so that's what people do. There's not really a good quote unquote reason for it other than that we all just kind of expect people to discuss that time frame, even whether or not it is actually the most important time frame in their life or not. So here's some sort of fleshing out of those ideas that I just talked about. Interestingly, what the most interesting piece to me is this really cool piece of evidence that falls under the cognitive hypothesis, which shows that this sort of arc, this framework of memory across age, is shifted for people who immigrated to the United States at a later age. So let's break down this graph. The red line shows us our sort of standard reminiscence bump, between the age of like 10 and 25 or 30, right? We get this standard sort of young adulthood adolescence bump. And it's for people who immigrated to the United States at this age, right? Between 20 and 24. So the cognitive sort of hypothesis says that this rapid change followed by stability is something that leads to this memory bump, right? The immigration, right, in early adulthood is this substantial event. And so that's why these people have the standard reminiscence bump. But if you look at people who immigrated to the United States later in life, in their mid 30s, they get a reminiscence bump in their mid 30s instead of early on, because now this is when the big important event happened, the rapid change followed by stability. And so they show a different pattern. So this is some good evidence for the cognitive hypothesis, arguing for the advantageous encoding of memories uh, during rapid change followed by stability. Okay. So the last thing we're going to talk about here in part one is memory for exceptional stimuli. And then this is going to lead us into part two for our discussion about maybe errors to these types of memories. So, what are things that are exceptional? They tend to be emotional events. And on average, people remember and more easily and more accurately and vividly remember emotional events. This is probably due to activation of the amygdala. This was the important area we talked about in chapter 7 with PTSD, right? It's the emotion center of the brain. The amygdala is what's sort of attaching or tagging that emotional valence onto our memories. And so we can see here over on the right whether or not you are stressed or not. I'm sorry. Let me sort of start that again. We're comparing memory for emotionally arousing pictures with neutral pictures. So red is our emotional pictures. Purple is the memory for our neutral pictures. When you are exposed to stress, you are more likely to remember the emotional pictures than the neutral pictures. And when you're not exposed to stress, then memory for these types of stimuli have no significant difference. They're much closer to one another. So the experience of stress is going to heighten our memory for these emotional events. And if you think about, why would a memory system do this? What's the purpose behind a stressful and emotional event being remembered? Is because stressful emotional things tend to be important for life and even like survival. I mean, think about a soldier with PTSD. Their memory is for a highly emotional image, right? Maybe the death of someone close to them or a traumatic, terrible scene from war during a time of stress. And what their brain is doing is they're saying, this was super critical for our survival, for our functioning, for maybe the survival of others. We need to remember this because it's important. Now, and it ends up having negative effects on their mental health down the line, of course, right? That's what PTSD is. But what the brain is simply doing is the brain is trying to figure out which things are critical to remember and which things are not critical to remember. And so highly emotional events during a time of stress are basically signals to your brain that this information needs to be remembered for sure. Now, at the most extreme sort of side of these exceptional events and exceptional stimuli are what we call flashbulb memories. These are generally societally or culturally shared, shocking, highly charged, important events. Like for millennials, my generation, the September 11th attacks on the Twin Towers are a flashbulb memory moment. If you talk to basically anyone between the ages of probably their mid 20s to their, basically mid 20s and older, they can probably tell you exactly where they were, what they were doing. They have this intense autobiographical memory of what was happening when September 11th happened, when they heard about it. So mine is, I was in ninth grade biology class. I was sitting at like sort of a 4-person lab table. Across from me was Brian Presley. Um, a teacher came running down the hallway screaming for everyone to turn on their TVs. Everyone stopped what we were doing. We turned on the TV. We watched, that morning, the first sort of footage in the news coming in, um, and it's this. I can close my eyes and I can re-experience that moment, that episodic memory, that autobiographical memory. Um, Generations tend to have their own sort of unique flashbulb memory moments. So for Gen X, who are people sort of in their late 30s, 40s, it's often listed as the Challenger explosion, the when the NASA shuttle blew up during takeoff on live television in the 80s, the early 80s, something like that. I might have that date a little bit wrong. Not my generation's flashbulb memory. And if you go again a little older, a little further back in time, you get things like the Kennedy assassination or MLK's assassination, where people of an older generation can tell you exactly what was happening, where they were, what they were doing when those events occurred. These tend to be highly emotional, vivid, and very detailed. People remember these things for the rest of their lives, and they swear by these memories. So, what's important to note is that these are not photographic memories, so to speak. Even though people are highly confident in them and will profess their accuracy for years and years and years, we actually find that they can change with the passage of time. So, here we go. Here's a date around the Challenger explosion. Maybe Challenger was like 91, something like that, 91. Some cognitive psychologists actually studied how people's memories changed over time about their experience with the Challenger explosion. So they took advantage of this event and they went around, they interviewed a bunch of people. Where were you? Who were you with? What were you doing? What was going on when you heard about the Challenger explosion? What's particularly relevant about the Challenger explosion, it was a huge event for schools at the time, because a teacher, an elementary school teacher, I believe, had sort of won this contest, where NASA was going to send a teacher into space. It was this idea NASA had to really connect with kids and the education system at the time, and so it made it maybe particularly tragic that this explosion occurred with a teacher on the shuttle, just an elementary school teacher, and so it was a huge event across schools in the United States, where everything kind of stopped, and all school age children at the time were watching this live on television, and so people will tell you exactly where they were and what they were doing, but then if you ask them, a week later, if you ask them a month later, if you ask them 6 months later, the details start to fade. Descriptions start to change, and inaccuracies or omissions of detail start to happen. Basically, people start to mess up their memories of this event, even though they claim extremely high confidence and vividness. So, even these highly emotional memories are subject to change. And this was repeated by Tallarico and Rubin after September 11th, 2001. So we have a paper published in 92 taking advantage of the Challenger disaster, then a paper in 2003 basically repeating the same experiment, taking advantage of September 11th. So again, people's ratings of things like vividness and their belief in the memories stay very high, but the accuracy of their details and the number of details they provide declines over time, even with flashbulb memories. Part of the reason that this might be happening is something known as the narrative rehearsal hypothesis. So for these big important events, what tends to happen is obviously after the event, for days or weeks or months, or I mean, in the case of these really big moments, JFK, MLK, 9/11, I mean, we get years of repeated viewing, hearing, talking about the event, seeing it on TV, newspaper, hearing it on radio, discussing it with other people. I mean, even now you're taking a class in which these things are being discussed. And this hypothesis, the narrative rehearsal hypothesis, says that people start to confuse the details with their own memories because this constant updating and rehearsal from sort of the external world starts to bleed into their own memories and can actually distort and change them and cause for there to be errors. This is also something that can happen with early childhood memories. So, for example, one of my earliest childhood memories is being at a hotel with my family, and I was maybe four at the time, 4 or 5, and I got stuck on the elevator by myself. My family got off the elevator. I was messing around, like looking at the pool or something at the back end of the elevator. I never got off the elevator. Doors close. I'm alone on the elevator. Elevator goes up to the 20th floor of the hotel. My mom's freaking out. I'm all by myself. The doors open. There's this random group of people. They all look confused. I'm scared and crying. So I have this, it's almost like a flashbulb memory from my early life. The problem is, if I'm really honest with myself, I'm not sure if I actually remember that event or if what I remember is my mom's story of that event and her retelling it in this narrative way. It keeps getting rehearsed as a story that my mom liked to tell, right, at family get-togethers or out with friends. Oh, we ever tell you about that? It was really scary at the time, but it turned out to be just kind of funny and okay. This time that Doug did this silly thing, got stuck on the elevator, right? If I'm honest, I don't know anymore whether I remember the event or whether I just remember my mom telling the event. That distinction is important because that's exactly what's happening with these flashbulb memories, with all this news coverage and repetition of the details over time. The repetition starts to bleed into the actual memory and distort it. Okay, so that's a good stopping place for part one. We will begin part two with a discussion of what this means about memory. And what this means is that memory is constructive. Memory is not set in stone. Memory is not photographic video evidence. Memory is malleable, and memory is constructive and reconstructive. And we'll talk about the implications of that for errors of memory. So thanks, everybody. Hope you enjoyed part one, and I will see you for chapter 8, part 2.